Hey, good morning, everybody. Hey, last week here, grades or quizzes are graded in grade book. So take a look at that. And we do not have a quiz this week. And this is the whole page. The weekly calendar will be on there. So today what we're going to do over the next two lessons is we're going to do a little bit of what we call tying algebra into geometry, kind of give you a lead into next year. And on Monday, which is today, we're going to do the midpoint formula. And then Wednesday, we're going to do the distance formula. And this is how we deal with 2 points on a coordinate plane. And we find the midpoint, and then we find the distance. So this is definitely an algebra-related topic that will come up in geometry. Canvas conference today, noon to 12:30. Yeah, I tell you, knock this out as soon as you can. Just, get up, watch it, do the homework, submit it. That way you don't have anything to do Tuesday. Wednesday, same thing. Get up. If you need help, come in 12 noon to 12:35 for questions. We can just, go through most of the homework questions as needed. And then Thursday will be that last Canvas conference. I do have to change the Tuesday's conference to 8 to 8:30 because I have to go over school to help with some laptop pickups for the seniors. So Friday, no video assignment. Just have a great summer. And now there will be a new modules. You've probably found it by now under the distance and midpoint formula. I'll send that out in your remind. All right, this is just our lesson here. Here's your weekly calendar. Same thing as just what we went over. We're going to have an assignment Monday over the midpoint formula. Tuesday, just get caught up, make sure it's turned in. Wednesday, distance formula video assignment due on Thursday, and then that is it. Again, no video or assignment on Friday. All right, guided notes are there. Print those off, fill those in as we go through here. So here's what we got. We want to develop and apply the midpoint formula. And then we'll get to the distance between 2 points. That's going to be on Wednesday. And as you take a look here, midpoint, exactly what it sounds like. It is the point halfway between two given points. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to calculate the average, okay, of the x coordinates and the average of the y coordinates. Well, when you calculate the average, you add them up and divide by the number of objects. So if you have test scores and you take the average of two tests, your first test was a 80, your second test was a 90, you add those up and you divide by 2. Okay, so hopefully, though, you would know the average would have to be an 85. So you take 80 plus 90, and then you divide it in half. And so that would be your average score. And we're going to do the same thing with coordinates for the midpoint. So if I'm given two endpoints, we'll call point A and point B. And here's how we designate their coordinates. Since they both have an X and Y, we say X sub 1. Like a sub sandwich or a submarine. X sub 1, comma, Y sub 1. And B is X sub 2, comma, Y sub 2. And then you add the X's together and you add the Y's together. We have to go halfway between the X's, which is the horizontal distance. And we got to go halfway between the Y's, which is the vertical distance. So just add up the X's, add up the Y's. Okay. And that's essentially it. Let's go through a couple examples here. All right, find the midpoint of the line segment with the given endpoints. Okay, so think of this as point A. Think of this as point B. You can think of this as x1, y1. You can think of this as x2, y2. So the midpoint, capital M, will be, and normally we don't put an equal sign for the points. You add, and I'm just going to write down the formula the first couple times. I won't do it every time. So you add the x's. That's the biggest thing. You don't just add the 2 points together. You add the x's. So the midpoint would be -8 plus -2 divided by 2, comma, then 3 plus 7 divided by 2. Well, watch how you type it in your calculator. If you just do -8 plus -2 divided by 2, that is wrong. That is not correct. You got to make sure that you hit -8 plus negative 2, which is negative 10. And you should, I mean, for the most part, you should be good with that without your calculator. And 3 plus 7 is 10. And so negative 10 divided by 2 is negative 5, and 10 divided by 2 is positive 5. And yes, you can just do negative 8 plus negative 2, it equals divided by 2. Only way to do this and put it in one step is if you wanted to do this in one step, you'd have to put parentheses around the numerator. Okay, as long as you're dealing with, well, for all of them. Okay, put parentheses around the numerator. But for most part, I think you can just do those mentally. So midpoint, negative 5, 5. Okay, we got the points 2, 4, and the points 1, negative 3. So that's point A and that's point B. So the midpoint will be the average of the x's, x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and the average of the y's. So the midpoint will be 2 plus 1, okay, divided by 2, and 4 plus negative 3 divided by 2. Now, you're not always going to get a whole number for answers. Well, what's 2 plus 1? 2 plus 1 is 3. And 4 plus negative 3, don't forget your rules. It's positive 1 over 2. So just leave that answer. 3 halves and 1 half. That is absolutely fine. Just leave that as 3 halves, comma 1 half. That is the midpoint there. And this third one here, negative 5.1, comma negative 2, and 1.4, 1.7. So they're not always nice whole numbers. Okay, sometimes that happens. That's okay. So this is A and this is B. Now, if they're in decimals, we can write our answer in decimals. So my midpoint is negative 5.1 plus 1.4. Okay, take their x's. That's x1, that's x2, divided by 2. The y's, so we take negative 2 plus 1.7 divided by 2. So negative 5.1 plus 1.4, okay, gives us negative 3.7 divided by 2, negative 1.85. Okay, negative 1.85. And now negative 2 plus 1.7 is negative 0.3 divided by 2 is negative 0.15. All right, so typically the rule is if your problems given in decimals, you can go ahead and put the answer in decimals. The problems just in whole numbers or fractional form, we want to keep it in fractional form. Those would, both be correct answers here. So the midpoint is negative 1.85 and negative 0.15. So that's halfway in between those points. Now the next couple kind of give you a good visual, and I like these because it gives you a good understanding. So this is our line segment. I want to find the midpoint between those. Well, I got 2 points here. I'll call this one A and this one B. Well, first thing you got to do is you got an extra step here, so you got to be careful you don't make a mistake. You got to give me the coordinates of both points. Well, point A is negative 1, negative 1. And the coordinates of point B is negative 5, and then that is also negative 5. Now, you can't just estimate. Now, you could, and sometimes you might be right and guess, but you're better off using the midpoint formula. So right here, that's x1, y1. That's x2, y2. And so my midpoint, add the x's, negative 1 plus negative 5 over 2 and then -1 plus -5. They actually happen to be both the same because both the x's are the same and both the y's are the same. Whoops. What's -1 plus -5? -1 plus -5. That's going to be -6. And then I'm going to do, whoops, I did something wrong. No, I did okay. And then the second one was the same thing, -1 plus -5. So right here, that becomes -6 divided by 2, comma, -6 divided by 2. Well, since those work out the whole numbers, we want to take it down to the whole numbers. And actually, you have to do that. Okay, -3, comma, -3. All right, does that make sense? I go over -3 down to -3. And the midpoint has to lie on the line connecting the 2 points. Okay, so if you made a mistake and you got -4, whatever, -2, that can't be the midpoint. So it has to lie on that line. So this one here, I'll call this point A. We'll call this point B. Well, A is 0, 0. B will be the point 5, 4. And so just think of this as x1, y1. Think of this as x2, y2. Our formula, and I'll write it down again just to help us learn it. X1 plus, add the x's together, divided by 2. And then you add the y's together, divided by 2. And so in this case here, you're going to get the x coordinate is 0, and the x coordinate of the second one is 5. And then you get 0 plus 4 divided by 2. Well, 0 plus 5 is 5, and 4 plus 2, or 0 plus 4 is 4. And that becomes a whole number. So 5 halves, I'm going to leave that because that's a decimal. And what is that decimal? 5 divided by 2 is 2.5. So if I'm going to plot this point, I go over 2.5 and I go up 2. Right there's that midpoint. It's halfway between the x's. Well, the x's go from 0 to 5. So halfway between would be 0 and would be 2.5. And then the midpoint for the y's would be halfway between 0 and 4, which is 2. Okay, so sometimes it's good to have a graph because you have a good visual for that. Okay, so that's dealing with given the graph. You got to take the midpoints off and then list the midpoint. Now, make sure you read the directions here. Make sure you read the directions. It says find the other endpoint of the line segment with the given endpoint and the given midpoint. So these are not, we can't just average these together. I know the midpoint is right here. This is one endpoint. Well, let's go back to our formula. The midpoint is x1 plus x2 divided by 2. And then y1 plus y2 divided by 2. Well, this is the x coordinate of the midpoint. So what I can say is x sub m equals x1 plus x2 divided by 2. And this is the y coordinate of the midpoint. So y sub m equals y1 plus y2 divided by 2. Well, I know the x coordinate of the midpoint. That will be x sub m. And I'll call this x sub m, y sub m. And I'll just call this could be x1 or x2, but I'm going to call it x1, y1. So I know the y coordinate is -9. I know the first x coordinate is -1. I don't know the second x coordinate. So I just call it x sub 2. And yeah, at this point, you could really just call it an x, but we'll call it x sub 2. And we always divide by 2. Now, here's this big tie between geometry and algebra. The midpoint's more of a geometry, but in order to find the midpoint, we got to know our algebra. We have to know it well. So at this point here, we multiply both sides by 2 to get rid of this 2. And when I do that, I get negative 2 times negative 9, which is negative 18. Those two just cancel, and you're left with negative 1 plus x sub 2. And I got to solve for that. So I add 1. And I get negative 17 equals x sub 2. Well, I'm going to do the similar procedure with the y's. The y sub m. The y coordinate of the midpoint is negative 10. I know one of the endpoints, and the other endpoint is a 9 divided by 2. Well, to get rid of that divided by 2, you're really just going to multiply 2 times negative 10 or multiply both sides by 2. That cancels. You're left with negative 20 equals 9 plus y sub 2. Subtract 9. I get negative 29 equals y sub 2. So the other endpoint is going to be negative 17, negative 29. Okay, a real quick check is if you add up if you take the average of the endpoints, it has to give you the midpoint. So if you take negative 1 plus your new coordinate, negative 17, divided by 2, that's got to give you the midpoint, negative 9. And then if I take 9 plus negative 29, I get negative 20. Divide that in half, you get negative 10. So you can do a quick check to make sure that this endpoint is correct, and we just checked it, and it is. So we can't take the average of those because we're not looking for the midpoint. We're looking for one of the endpoints. All right, that second one there, and you might have to do some of that work on the back because I don't know if you have quite enough room there at the bottom of the sheet. And it never hurts to have an idea what's going on here. So, and I'm just you don't have to do this, but this kind of gives me a visual. This is an endpoint. I'll call it my A point. It's 5, negative 2, which is right here. My midpoint, my endpoint is 5, 2. My midpoint is negative 10. Way out here, negative 2. So where's that other endpoint have to be? This is the midpoint. It has to go all the way through there, and it has to be way over here. So just kind of sometimes given a visual gives you a good idea. All right, where should everything be laid out at? Okay, so if you got your other endpoint like it, I don't know, negative 2, like no, that can't work. So sometimes just draw out the scenario so that you at least have that in front of you. All right, so we're going to go back to what we know here. We know the midpoint is x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and then you add the y's together. And if I break that up, this is the x sub m, the x coordinate of the midpoint. This is y sub m. So the x coordinate of the midpoint is the average of the x's. And like I said, I'll call this x sub m, y sub m. And I'm going to call this one x sub 1, not a plus, comma, y sub 1. And then y sub m is the average of the y's. All right, what's my x coordinate of the midpoint? It is negative 10. That equals the first endpoint, which is 5, plus the second endpoint, which we don't know, divided by 2. And I'm just going to finish this one here. When I get to here, I multiply both sides by 2. That just cancels that 2. 2 times negative 10 is not negative 12. It is negative 20 equals 5 plus x sub 2. And then to find the x coordinate, I subtract 5, and I get negative 25. Okay, what's the y coordinate midpoint? I know what that is. That is negative 2. And what is one coordinate of the endpoint? It is 2. And we got a lot of 2's running around here. I need to get rid of this 2 here. So I multiply both sides by 2. And when I do that, that cancels. 2 times -2 is -4. And you get 2 plus y sub 2. Subtract 2, and I get -6 equals y sub 2. So my midpoint, or not my midpoint, my other endpoint. My other endpoint is -25, comma, -6. And again, you can do a quick check by taking your endpoints now and just doing the average and see if they come up with your coordinates to the midpoint. -25 plus 5 hit equals divided by 2 gives me -10. And then I got -6 plus 2 equals -4 divided by 2 does equal -2. So I can just have a quick check there. Okay, this is midpoint. Some cases you're given the midpoint, you find one of the endpoints. Some cases, like in the initial one, you're given the 2 endpoints, you find the midpoint, and you use the midpoint formula in either way. Okay, so on that module, you got your midpoint formula worksheet. We're going to do 2 through 26 even. Okay, write the original points down. Okay, and show your work. And by showing work, okay, so the original points are, I don't know, 311 and 1117. Just the midpoint. I got to see 3 plus 11. Actually, this is not a good pick. Let me make this a 13. 3 plus 13 divided by 2. 11 plus 17 divided by 2. And then if you get, you can do that on your calculator. That's 16 divided by 2, which is 8. And that's 28 divided by 2, which is 14. Okay. I need to see how you're doing that. All right. You guys have a great day. Get this done. Get this turned in. Okay. Don't wait. Don't wait. Do it now. All righty.